They didn't want the silver because it was beautiful. They wanted it because they believed the world was lying. That's the rumor that followed them through trading floors and private jets, through whispered phone calls and sleepless nights on Wall Street. Two brothers, oil money, an ancient metal, and a moment in American history when the idea of money itself began to crack. What happened next nearly broke the U.S. financial system, exposed the fragility of markets, and revealed something deeply uncomfortable about how power really works. This is the story of how two oil tycoons tried to outsmart America by buying too much silver, and almost succeeded. The bold claim at the heart of this story is simple, unsettling, and still debated today. A pair of private citizens, acting largely within the rules as written, came closer than anyone in modern history to cornering a major global commodity. Not a niche asset, not a speculative startup, silver, a metal woven into currency, industry, culture, and trust itself. In doing so, they exposed the invisible machinery of finance and forced the world to confront a dangerous question. Who really controls money? Governments, markets, or those wealthy enough to bend both? To understand how this happened, you have to step back into a world gripped by anxiety. The 1970s were not kind to American confidence. The Vietnam War had drained blood and treasure. The gold standard had collapsed. Inflation was eating savings alive. Gas lines snaked around city blocks. Trust in institutions was evaporating. The dollar no longer felt permanent. It felt political, fragile, temporary. And when people stop trusting paper, they start trusting weight. Silver had always been there. Quietly, coins, cutlery, jewelry, conductors, photography, medicine. It didn't shout like gold, but it endured. It had survived empires. It didn't depend on promises. It simply existed. And in a decade defined by broken promises that mattered, into this anxious world stepped Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt. Sons of H.L. Hunt, one of the richest oil men in American history, their father had risen from near poverty to unimaginable wealth. Drilling oil in East Texas and building an empire that smelled of crude and independence, he was a man who distrusted banks, distrusted Washington, distrusted anything that required faith rather than force. That worldview soaked into his sons like oil into sand. The Hunt brothers grew up surrounded by wealth, but also by suspicion. They learned early that power could vanish if you trusted the wrong people. They watched governments print money. They watched inflation quietly steal from savers. And they asked themselves a question that would later echo through the global economy. What if the dollar is the illusion? At first, their interest in silver seemed almost philosophical. A hedge, a store of value, something real in a world drifting toward abstraction. But ideas, when combined with enormous capital and unshakable conviction, have a way of becoming dangerous. They didn't rush in loudly. They didn't announce their intentions. They bought silver the way oil men buy land. Quietly, patiently, relentlessly. Physical silver bars, tons of it. Stored in vaults across the world, Switzerland, London, New York, the metal stacked. Higher and heavier, as if preparing for a siege at the time. Silver was cheap by historical standards. Forgotten, underloved. The Hunts saw opportunity where others saw boredom. And every ounce they bought removed supply from the market. Prices began to rise. Slowly at first, almost politely. This was the first turning point, though few recognized it as such. The moment when accumulation became influence. As prices climbed, something subtle shifted. Traders noticed unusual demand. Whispers spread that someone big was buying. Then rumors hardened into names. The Hunt brothers. Oil money. Texas confidence. Suddenly silver wasn't boring anymore. It was exciting. It was moving. And when something moves, people chase it. Speculators piled in. Hedge funds followed. Small investors scraped together savings. The metal that once sat quietly in vaults was now the most talked about asset in the world. Prices surged. $10 an ounce, then 20, then higher. Each jump reinforced the belief that silver was the future and paper was the past. The Hunts didn't just buy physical silver. They leveraged futures contracts, massive positions, control not just of metal, but of expectation. They weren't merely holding silver, they were shaping the psychology of the market. This is where the story becomes morally complicated. Were they manipulators? Or were they simply believers acting on conviction in a broken system? They argued they were protecting wealth against inflation, against government irresponsibility. Critics said they were hoarding, distorting, threatening the economy. Both were right, and that's what made it so dangerous. By late 1979, the price of silver was exploding. It hit levels no one had seen in generations. The Hunts, on paper, were worth billions more than they had ever been. Their influence stretched across continents. Industrial users panicked. Jewelry makers froze. Governments watched nervously. Silver wasn't just a commodity anymore. It was a symbol, a referendum on trust, and symbols scare institutions. The public reaction turned sharp. Headlines screamed about silver kings. Late-night hosts joked about Texans buying the moon. Politicians warned of economic sabotage. Banks began to worry. Because while prices were rising, leverage was rising faster. The entire structure rested on borrowed money. That was the hidden fault line. The same tool that amplified the Hunts' power also amplified their risk. Margin calls loomed like storm clouds, and the higher silver climbed, the more fragile the system became. Then came the moment the music stopped, in early 1980. Exchanges changed the rules. Position limits tightened. Margin requirements increased. Suddenly, it became harder and more expensive to hold silver. What had once felt like a free climb now felt like gravity returning all at once. Prices stalled, then dipped. And when confidence cracks, it shatters fast. As silver fell, margin calls exploded. The Hunts were required to post hundreds of millions of dollars in cash to maintain their positions. Cash they didn't have readily available because their wealth was tied up in metal that was now falling in value. This was the second turning point, the reversal. Panic spread through the market. Traders scrambled to exit. Prices collapsed. In a matter of weeks, silver plunged from nearly $50 an ounce to a fraction of that. Fortunes evaporated. Investors were ruined. Banks stared into the abyss. March 27, 1980, became known as Silver Thursday. On that day, the Hunts teetered on default. Had they fallen, a chain reaction could have rippled through major financial institutions. The Federal Reserve watched closely. Emergency meetings were held. A bailout was quietly arranged not to save the Hunts, but to save the system. The irony was brutal. The men who distrusted paper money nearly destroyed the very paper-based system they feared. And the system they challenged survived by rewriting the rules. Public sentiment turned vicious. The Hunts were no longer bold contrarians. They were villains, greedy, reckless, dangerous. Lawsuits piled up. Investigations followed. Congress held hearings. The narrative hardened. Two rich men tried to corner the market and paid the price. But history, like silver, reflects differently depending on the light. The Hunts lost billions. Their empire fractured. Legal battles dragged on for years. Bankruptcy followed. The dream of controlling silver dissolved into court documents and cautionary tales. Yet, the questions they raised never went away. What is money, really? Who decides its value? Why is hoarding silver considered manipulation, but printing trillions in currency considered policy? Why are some forms of power celebrated while others are criminalized? In the decades since, markets have grown more complex, more abstract, more detached from physical reality. Derivatives upon derivatives, numbers chasing numbers. And every so often, crisis reminds the world that confidence is the real currency. Silver still exists, quiet, unassuming, used in solar panels. Electronics, medicine. The Hunts are gone from the spotlight. But their shadow lingers in every conversation about market manipulation, systemic risk, and the thin line between genius and hubris. Their story isn't really about silver. It's about belief. Belief that systems can fail. Belief that wealth can protect. Belief that if you're bold enough, rich enough, determined enough, you can bend history. Sometimes you can. Sometimes history bends back. In the end, the Hunt brothers didn't break America, but they revealed its pressure points. They showed how close confidence always is to collapse, how quickly markets can turn into mobs, how power invites resistance, and perhaps most haunting of all, they prove that even in a world governed by rules, the real battle is always psychological, because money is not just metal or paper or code, it is faith, and faith, when shaken, never sounds the same again.